we're going to begin and want to welcome everyone, Modin Simcha, Chag Sameach, to one of the highlights of our Sukkot and our programming calendar is always to have Rabbi Rosensweig address us during Sukkot in the Sukkah. So it's a great honor to have you once again. We're very grateful that we're able to organize it in these challenging times to continue the tradition of having your shiur and address our community. The only thing that's lacking this year is the deli sandwiches. But maybe next year we'll have double deli sandwiches to make up for this year. But the main thing, of course, is the Torah, and that we are able to provide. So thank you so much, Rabbi Rosensweig, for joining us. I would like to call upon Chazan Malavani to formally introduce Rabbi Dr. Rosensweig this evening.
Thank you, Rabbi Ben. It is with the utmost respect that I am honored to introduce Rav Rosensweig to our congregation and many other participants at Rav Rosensweig's weekly shiur at our Fifth Avenue Synagogue. Rav Rosensweig really does not need introductions. And today I see that Rav Rosensweig is getting two introductions. An outstanding Rosh Yeshiva at Ritz, Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary at Yeshiva University, a Talmid Muvhak, a clear, proper Talmid pupil of the late Rav Joseph Soloveitchik, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. Rav Rosensweig is globally known as a great Talmid Chacham in our generation. As we say in Hebrew, maleh vegadush, fully knowledgeable in halacha ve'agada, a direct follower of the study of the Talmud in the Brisker system, which means a deep analytical interpretation each word of the Torah, the Talmud, the Rambam, Rishonim, Achronim, etc. I regard myself as a Talmid Muvhak of Rav Rosensweig by attending his weekly shiur at our Fifth Avenue Synagogue for many years, either in person or for the last quite a few months via Zoom. I recall that it was Rabbi Solroff, our emeritus rabbi, who years ago brought Rav Rosensweig for a Shabbat as a scholar of residence, and the unbelievable impression Rav Rosensweig left with our congregation. Not only did I express my appreciation to Rav Rosensweig, but on Motzai Shabbat, on Saturday night, I called Rav Rosensweig's father, Rabbi Bernard Rosensweig, who should be well for many years to come, to give him a yashar koach for the great son he has. Ever since, the profound relationship between the Rosensweig family and the Malovanis has grown with a deep appreciation to Rav Rosensweig's Torah we have learned from him, coupled with the system of brisk, as I mentioned before, Torah analysis, which we are lucky to learn from him. Tonight's shiur is an annual shiur from the Sukkah on issues pertaining to the philosophy and halachic and customs, minhagim, of the holiday of Sukkot. Rav Rosensweig, we all at our Fifth Avenue Synagogue and beyond look eagerly forward to your shiur this evening on Sukkot. You are far above the title as scholar in residence. You are a major contributor to the religious quality of the lives of our Fifth Avenue Synagogue, a shul, a synagogue that has always been the bastion of Torah utfilah b'makom echad, Torah and prayer in one place. Rav Rosensweig, Moadim Lesimcha, Gmar Tov, a good kvittel, we are in your Torah hands. Please, psok lanu psukcha. Thank you and welcome, and we look very much forward.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I appreciate the warm words of Chazan Malavani. He mentioned the relationship that we have and that we continue to develop. And really, it's very happy every week to be able to see him, whether it's by Zoom, especially we look forward to seeing him again in person, but his involvement in the shiur and his love for not only tefillah, which everybody knows, but his love for limud haTorah and his, very intense involvement in the shiur and the shaklavataria is something that speaks for itself and something that I admire very much. So again, I appreciate his expertise, but also his passion, as somebody who is dedicated to limud haTorah and to harbatzas haTorah, and that makes him a very special individual. I want to thank everybody for coming. I agree with Rabbi Babbage that we're certainly missing the sandwiches, but it's always, of course, nice to be live and in person, and to be in the synagogue, Sukkah, which is always very challenging. There's a lot of what they call celestial engineering going on there, with Dofen Akuma and other such things. It's a very fascinating Sukkah. We have to make sure to sit exactly in the right place. But I miss it very much not being there this year, not seeing everybody in person. And like everybody else, eagerly look forward to when things begin to normalize so that we can, interact in a more personal way. In the interim, it's been amazing to be able to keep things going through Zoom. And we absolutely will continue with that as long as it is necessary. I should just, on a commercial note, say, I think I mentioned before, next Tuesday night there might be a scheduling problem. I'm scheduled to have a wedding next Tuesday night, so maybe we'll start next week's year on a different night, but I'll try to work that out with the office. So for our regular participants in the shiur, just, I guess, stay tuned, and we'll try to figure out exactly how we start. But after that, we'll be on regular Tuesday night, 7:30, all things being equal. Beginning, we had one shiur already on Masechet Psachim. We're, now discussing Sukkah, and Sukkah and Pesach are actually very interconnected. Tetvav. They're very parallel in many ways. So we'll be continuing with that, hopefully sometime next week, and then going forward. And we look forward to a year of joyous and meaningful learning of that particular Masechta. Okay.
Amen.
Let's begin with the topic for the evening. I try to switch off. I don't know if it goes this way every year, but between the major themes of the holiday, the Sukkah and the Mitzvah of Lulav, I try to switch off and speak about, each one of them, different years. I believe last year we spoke a lot about the Sukkah and the Bracha and the Sukkah. So this year is the turn of the Lulav. And since it's also a little bit, loeg l'rash, to speak about the Sukkah when we should be there, and instead we're on Zoom. So I thought that tonight's topic really should be on the mitzvah of Dalet Minim. But of course, both of these mitzvahs characterize the holiday and are relevant to understanding the role that it plays more broadly in Jewish thinking and in Jewish law, which we're going to discuss. So let me talk about the mitzvah of Lulav more generally first, and try to develop in particular what I think is the subtle yet compellingly is the view of the Rambam regarding this particular mitzvah. So let's start with the beginning. Marmakomos were disseminated as usual. We want to thank the office, as we thank them for the weekly contribution, but in a special shiur, it gives us a special opportunity to thank Sheila and everybody in the office who is always so gracious and cooperative. So everybody should have, I guess, sheets, for tonight's shiur. So the first entry, I guess, number one, in tonight's sheets are the psukim in Parshas Emor. And these psukim are very fascinating because they seem to come almost as an afterthought of the entire Parsha and the specific treatment of Sukkot. Let me explain what I mean. Parshas Emor is the source of our knowledge of the Moadim. There are several Parshas in the Torah that deal with the Moadim, most prominently Parshas Emor, the main one. Then, of course, in Parshas Pinchas, you have the Musafim. Then in Parshas Re'eh, you have the Gimel Regalim. Of course, Sukkot is discussed in all three of those Parshios. But in Parshas Emor, what happens is truly extraordinary. And that is that the Torah says, Eila Moadei Hashem Asher Tikro, etc. And then it begins with a discussion of Shabbos, topic in its own right, transitions from there, beginning the calendar, not in Tishrei, but in Nisan, with the Korban Pesach and Chag HaMatzos. And from there, it discusses Chag HaShavuos, the Sfiras HaOmer, Chag HaShavuos, and then from there transitions into Chodesh Tishrei, B'Chodesh HaShvi, B'Echad LaChodesh, that's where you have Rosh Hashanah. A few weeks back, we spoke about the pasuk Zichron Trua, which characterizes Rosh Hashanah in Parshas Emor, and its relationship to Yom Trua Yelachem, which appears in Parshas Pinchas. But Rosh Hashanah, of course, is dealt with in Parshas Emor. And then after you have B'Chodesh Hazeh, the phrase that the Ramban notes is a way of the Torah signifying that it's not a coincidence that these three holidays take place in the same month. It's B'Chodesh HaShvi, and that's Rosh Hashanah. Then it's B'Chodesh HaShvi Hazeh, and it refers to Yom Kippur. Ach, on the 10th day. And then you have, of course, B'Chodesh HaShvi Hazeh again, with respect to the holiday of Sukkot. Then it appears as if the Torah wraps up Parshas HaMoadim. It seems to finish with that. And it says, these are the Moadim with all of their korbanos. And then all of a sudden, it's almost like a false ending. So the Torah comes back and provides, 6 or so, or 5 or 6, more psukim, beginning with, and this is what I had copied here, Ach, b'chamisha yom lachodesh hashvi, however, right, on the 15th day of the 7th month, ba'as b'chem b'stfuas haaretz, tachogus chag Hashem shivas yamim, b'yom harishon shabbason, b'yom hashmini shabbason. So after already describing the holiday of Sukkot and calling it Chag HaSukkos, telling us that there's Mikroi Kodesh, the Torah returns to the same theme for some reason, and as a second rendition, it's the only one of the Moadim that gets a second treatment, for it. And that is very remarkable. The question is, why does the Torah do that? Moreover, it's here and only here where the Torah introduces the mitzvah that we're speaking about this evening, and that's the mitzvah of the Daled Minim. So the Torah says, Pasuk Mem, Ulekachtem lachem b'yom harishon, you should take on the first day of the Chag, meaning of Sukkot, Pri Eitz Hadar, Kapos Tmarim, Ve'anaf Eitz Avos, Ve'arve Nachal. I'm emphasizing the Vavs because the Gemara notices them and emphasizes them. We'll get to that in just a minute. Usmachtem lifnei Hashem Elokechem Shivas Yamim. And this is a source of joy in Lifnei Hashem Elokechem. Gemara darshans that this also refers to the Beis Hamikdash. They used to take Minat Torah as a biblical obligation they would take the Daled Minim every day in the Beis Hamikdash, but outside of the Beis Hamikdash, they would take it on the first day. Either way, this is a source of great joy for all 7 days in the Mikdash. Our practice, of course, today is a Mishnah in Sukkah, is that after the Churban Habayis, there was a takana that in order to remember what took place during the period in which Jewish life flourished, in other words, when the Beis Hamikdash was up and running and a focal point of Jewish life, so they made a takana, and that's why we take the Daled Minim not only on the first day, but on all 7 days. Right? That's our practice. Tomorrow we'll take the Daled Minim. Minat Torah, outside of the Beis Hamikdash or Yerushalayim, according to the Rambam thinks the Mikdash and Yerushalayim are one halacha in this matter. But Minat Torah, they used to only take the Daled Minim outside of the Beis Hamikdash on the first day. Either way, this mitzvah of Netilas Lulav, 7 days in the Mikdash and 1 day everywhere else, the Kol Mosh V'Seichem, if you will, is discussed only in this parsha, in the second rendition of Sukkot in Parshas Emor. It doesn't appear anywhere else. Not in the other parshios, not in other words, Pinchas and Re'eh, and not in the initial presentation of Sukkot, which is together with all the other holidays. As if to establish that this second mitzvah of Sukkot is something that is very singular, then in fact it's integrated with the mitzvah of the Sukkah by the next psukim, v'chagosem osachad l'Hashem shivas yamim b'shana chukat olam l'dorotechem b'chodesh hashvi tachogru oso, right? And then basukos teishvu shivas yamim kol ezrach b'Yisrael yeshu basukot l'man yedu dorosechem ki basukos hashavtis b'nei Yisrael b'otzi osam me'eretz Mitzrayim ani Hashem elokechem. So basically, this second rendition does 2 things. It includes a new halacha that was never known or never formulated and is never formulated anywhere else in the Torah. And then it revisits Yeshiva B'Sukkah, which is already alluded to earlier, as if somehow, this presentation of the Daled Minim also adds a dimension to our appreciation and understanding of Sukkot too. And the question is, why did the Torah do this? What is the nature of this special mitzvah? And again, how does it, reflect upon Sukkot? So I'd like to suggest is that this entire parsha, especially the beginning of it, echoes the language, and also by virtue of the fact, parallel language, but by virtue of the fact that it is also a polar opposite in some respects, it juxtaposes for us Yom Kippur and Sukkot. And I've mentioned this in the past. Firstly, both parshios, the second parsha of Sukkot and the parsha of Yom Kippur, begin with the word ach. And ach is a jarring note. Ein ach ela miut. What that miut is discussed. But the fact that there are 2 moadim that are treated with this kind of dissonant, in this limiting introduction, ach, certainly, binds them together. Moreover, Yom Kippur is called a Mikra Kodesh, as are all the other Chagim that are dealt with in the Parsha and Emor. The term Mikra Kodesh is ubiquitous, but as we've noted many, many times in past pre-Yom Kippur shiurim, the phrase Mikra Kodesh in connection with Yom Kippur is actually formulated differently than all the others. All the others are connected with the generic Isur Malacha, Mikra Kodesh, Kol Malachas Avoda Lo Sa'asu, and Yom Kippur is connected with the specifics of that Chag. Mikra Kodesh, the Nisem Es Nafsho Seichem. or the Isur Malacha, which isn't just Malacha Savoda, but Kol Malacha. In the second rendition of Sukkot, as opposed to the first, the term Mikra Kodesh is not mentioned at all. If you notice, the term Shabbason is mentioned. That's a second, although through its oppositeness, Mikra Kodesh is dealt with differently in Yom Kippur and in the second parsha of Sukkot, the one that introduces Lulav. Both parshios, Yom Kippur and the Lulav parsha, begin with the word Ach. And in both cases, and only in these two cases, there's a kind of Tameh HaMitzvos. The Torah itself finds it necessary to kind of justify why it is that we have these holidays or these expressions. In the case of Yom Kippur, of course, Ki Yom Kippurim Hu Lechaper Alechem, and in Parshas Acharei Mos you have it even more strongly, Ki Bayom Hazeh Chaper Alechem L'Taher Eschem Mikol Chatosechem L'Fnei Hashem Tetaru. But even in Emor you have Ki Yom Kippurim Hu L'Chaper Alechem. And then, of course, in this parsha, which introduces the Lulav, you have Leman Yedu Dorosechem, right? Ki V'Sikos Hoshafti B'nei Yisrael Botzios Eretz Mitzrayim, which is almost like Tamei Mitzvos. To such an extent, by the way, that the Bach, in a very famous passage, argues that when you sit in the sukkah, even though we normally paskin, let's say, mitzvos, ein tzrichos kavana, that you don't have to have kavana for the mitzvah in order to fulfill the mitzvah. You just have to do the mitzvah properly. Nonetheless, says the Bach, when it comes to the mitzvah of sukkah, maybe by extension lulav, Bach says, mitzvah tzrichos kavana, because the Torah says explicitly, Leman yedu dorasechem ki b'sukkos hoshavtis b'nei Yisrael. The son-in-law of the Bach, the Taz, kind of changed it a little bit. Not so much that mitzvah tzrichos kavana. Mitzvah tzrichos kavana refers to a kavana to fulfill the mitzvah. So Taz says, not sure you need that, but there's certainly an awareness and a cognizance of the importance and significance of what it is that you're celebrating. That this is something that should command our attention in a significant way. That is a requirement. He thinks that is unique to Yeshiva B'Sukkah, maybe also Tefillin and Tzitzis, where you have similar Iman Tizkuru, etc. There's a special halacha. But the point I'm trying to make is that there seems to be a very strong parallel, at least three that I've drawn so far, and that should suffice for now, between this second rendition of Chag HaSukkot and Yom Kippur. And surely that is very significant. Let me go a step further. If we just look at the mitzvah of Lulav as described in this pasuk, there are two other, very significant phenomena that need to be addressed. And they're independent topics, but I just want to mention both of them. I think they are possibly connected. I'm speaking about one this evening, not the other. And that is as follows. Number one, the pasuk of Ulekachtem lachem b'yom harishon pri eitz hadar kapos tamarim anafei tzavos arvi nachal smachtem pnei Hashem Elokeichem shivat yamim is a pasuk which divides is a pasuk which is divided between two different venues and diffuses this mitzvah in ways, that typically would require separate psukim and separate mitzvahs. As we noted, Minat Torah, you only pick up the lulav outside of the Mikdash in Yerushalayim on the first day. But in the Beis HaMikdash, it's usmachtem b'fnei Hashem Elokeichem shivas yamim. And it's interesting that is all in one pasuk. But let me take it a step further. The Rambam in Sefer Mitzvos, Mitzvah Kuf Samach Tes, and in the Koteret to Hilchos Lulav, or actually in the beginning of Hilchos Shofar, the Rambam speaks about all three mitzvahs that are discussed in this, heading. The heading is shofar, sukkah, lulav. So he speaks about the mitzvah of shofar, the mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah, and the mitzvah of lulav. When he talks about the mitzvah of lulav, he says the mitzvah is to take the lulav all 7 days in the mikdash. In Sefer Mitzvos, it's a little bit, more even-handed. He starts off by saying the mitzvah is to take the lulav in the mikdash all 7 days. But of course, in Gvulin, outside of the mikdash, the mitzvah is limited to 1 day. He doesn't even mention it, the koteret, to these halachos. My point being that I believe that the Rambam was enormously impressed by the fact that Torah Shebechsav, that the Torah itself presented the two dimensions of the mitzvah of lulav, one in the mikdash and one in Gvulin, in the same pasuk. And the fact that it did this impressed him that this is a single mitzvah. That the mitzvah of lulav is a mitzvah which is more intensely implemented in a mikdash and less intensely b'medina, but it's important that it's in both. Indeed, I spoke, before Rosh Hashanah about Rosh Hashanah Shecholios B'Shabbos. We talked about Zichron Trua. I mentioned then that there's a discrepancy that Rishonim point out, based on the Makoros, it's clear, between lulav and shofar. Because lulav, at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, when they knew the Kviya Diarcha, when they knew exactly when, the new moon was and the calendar, they would take the lulav on Shabbos, not only in the Mikdash, but everywhere. And in shofar, the rule is that they only take it in the Mikdash. Once the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, and there was more question about, precise knowledge of the calendar, that's when the decision was made, that just like in shofar, you will not take the lulav on Shabbos, even if it's the first day. But in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, they didn't take shofar outside of the Mikdash if it was on Shabbos, but they did take lulav even outside the Mikdash on the first day if it was Shabbos. That's a very remarkable difference. And the question is, why? And different answers are given.
Is it the same as shofar? By the way, shofar in the Beis HaMikdash, they would use the shofar on Shabbos and not. Is it similar to shofar?
I think I just addressed that. What I tried to say was that no, it's half the same, and the big.
Okay.
I'm accentuating the half that's different.
Okay,
the
sorry.
shofar, they took it in the Mikdash on Shabbos, but they didn't take it outside the Mikdash on Shabbos, right? Even though that's the only day that it's Doraisa. In Lulav, not now, but when the Beis HaMikdash was Kayam, they took the Lulav not only in the Beis HaMikdash, but also in the Fifth Avenue Synagogue on Shabbos, when the first day was Shabbos. That's a huge difference between Lulav and Shofar, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the Gemara says, why did they do that? So the Gemara says, the reason that they did that was because the first day is unique. Because it's the only day where you have to take shofar, both Bigvulin and in the Beis HaMikdash. And the way the Rambam formulates it is, the Rambam says, you see from there that even in the Beis HaMikdash, the first day is singular, because the fact that they're taking it in the rest of the world matters. Now, what that tells us is that there aren't two completely different mitzvos, one in the Mikdash and one in the Gvulin, but that it's two expressions or two manifestations of the same mitzvah. And that's a very strange idea. And shofar apparently doesn't have that, because the shofar, it's just, according to most people, it's just one mitzvah, not two different manifestations of it. So the first thing to note is that in this pasuk is that it's remarkable. The first phenomenon, right, is the phenomenon that you can have one mitzvah, and I say it's more acute in the Rambam than anywhere else, because for him to introduce, remember, Hilchos Lulav isn't Sefer Zmanim. Sefer Zmanim is about the Moadim that apply anywhere and everywhere. The Rambam has Svarim that are dedicated to the Beis HaMikdash. Sefer Avoda, Sefer HaKarbanos, and yet, in a mitzvah that is prominent in Zmanim, the Rambam says that the mitzvah is to take the lulav all 7 days in the Mikdash. Of course, when he starts detailing the halachos, he tells you that's only in the Mikdash. Otherwise, you only take it the first day, Minat Torah, and then we have the Gzeira that extended Zeicher l'Chorban, etc. But what emerges is in the Rambam that there's a dual relationship. What we do in the Mikdash is relevant in Big Vulin, and what we do Big Vulin is intensifies the first day in the Mikdash. That's very remarkable. So that's phenomenon number one. I believe these phenomena are related, but I'm not going to speak so much about this first one now. I will allude to it very quickly. Back. The second phenomenon is, and by the way, even in Torah Shebechsav, this is a very rare phenomenon. Somebody mentioned to me recently that you have something similar in the Chatzotzros, the trumpets, where there's the trumpets that accompany the bringing of a korban in the Beis HaMikdash, and the trumpets, that you sound in a time of crisis, a time of war. Rambam actually counted those as one mitzvah too, very remarkably. Anyways, that's phenomenon number one. Phenomenon number two is simply the configuration, the details of this mitzvah. Where do we find a mitzvah which has so many components, so many moving parts, if you will, and yet which are part of a single institution? You have it a little bit. You have tefillin shel yad, tefillin shel rosh, right? Although the differences are not as great. They're both tefillin. You have it in tzitzis a little bit, tchelas and lavan. But it's easier to see the two tefillas, the two, expressions of tefillin, and to see, the lavan, and the tchelas as, kind of details. But when it comes to, here we have 4 minim, and these 4 minim seem quite different from each other. So where do we find, both the quantity, but especially this notion of a mitzvah with all these components, all these moving parts, and what does that mean, and what is that significant? Indeed, if we look at the psukim, it's already clear that the Torah is hinting at the relationships, and this is something that is fleshed out in the Mishnayos and in the Gemara. So, for example, if you look at the pasuk in pasuk Mem, it says "V'kachtem lachem b'yom harishon pri eitz hadar kapos tamarim." Right? There's no vav, not pri eitz hadar v'kapos tamarim. Right? After the kapos tamarim comes ve'anaf eitzavos ve'arvei nachal. So then you have 2 vavs. So the Gemara actually discusses this. If you look at Mar Makom number 2, you have an interesting Mishnah, because it's not just that you have 4 components, right? From our point of view, the 4 also have different numbers, right? 1 lulav, 1 esrog, 3 hadasin. It's really complicated. It's a very complex mitzvah. We don't find anything like it. So actually, it's a debate in the Mishnah, number 2. Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Shlosha Hadasim, Shtei Ravos, Lulav Echad, Esrog Echad. That's what we do, right? You have, 3, 2, 1, 1. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Kishem Shalulav Echad, V'Esrog Echad, Kach Hadas Echad, V'Arava Achas. By the way, the word Kishem is also very intriguing, right? We know what it means, just like. But whenever there's a kashem, right, that conceptually, like you wonder, like, what do you mean kashem? It sounds like, if there are going to be 4 components, they should be equally weighted. Each one should have 1. You shouldn't have 3 of some and 2 of another, and then, 2 more each with 1. So we don't paskin like Rabbi Akiva. There are some Rishonim who thought that b'diavad we did. The Rambam certainly doesn't paskin like Rabbi Akiva, paskin like Rabbi Shmuel. So what happened to the kashem? The kashem itself almost tells us that the components here have a relationship, and therefore they should all be on equal footing. And then Rabbi Shmuel is saying they do have a relationship, and probably that's the reason that they're not on equal footing. That's number one. So you have this fascinating argument in the Mishnah. Then the Gemara says, Tanya Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Pri Eitz Hadar, Echad, Kapos Tmarim, Echad. The diuk is that it says kapos, but it's spelled kapas, without a vav.
Without a vav, yeah.
Yeah. Anafei tzavos, that's 3 words. So that's shlosha. Arvei nochal, 2 words, or the fact that it's plural, shtayim. Okay, let's skip a line for Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva Omer kashem shalulav echad v'esrog echad kachadas echad v'arava achas. So then the Gemara says, Amar lo Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar said, Yochol, this is even more interesting. Yochol yihei esrog imoin ve'aguda achas. Maybe the esrog should be, like we take the minim, 3 of them, with an eged. Maybe the esrog should be me'ugad with the other minim. That would be a difficult thing to do since it's round. I don't know how that would work exactly, but that's not my job to figure that part out. I mean, some esrogim are not so round, I guess. Maybe this is a proof for those, more, picturesque, I guess, esrogim. The Gemara says, Amris, the chinamar pri eitz hadar, the kapos tamarim. Does the Torah say with a vav? That would imply that they're integrated. Halolo nemar ela kapos, right? Without a vav. So what's fascinating is there's an issue about the numbers. Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva both are interesting. The kashem of Rabbi Akiva and the alternative of Rabbi Shmuel. Then you had an interesting havamina that you should integrate the esrog fully with the others. And we're being told, Kamash Malan, that you don't exactly do that. Then the next line of the Gemara becomes particularly interesting. Uminayin shema akvin zeh. How do you know that all of them are necessary? Talmud Omer lekachtem. Shetehei lekicha tama. A complete lekicha. Because once you have many moving parts, whether it's 4 meaning or different numbers of some of the 4, how do you know that b'diavad you can't get away with, partial or everyone but one? It has to be lekicha tama. Okay. So it's fascinating several things. Number one, this question of the esrog, just to explain it a little better. It's clear the Gemara thought that maybe it should be even more integrated. The four should be 1. And the Gemara says, no, it's not in the egghead. The Gemara later on seems to say that the esrog should be in the left hand and that the 3 should be in the right hand. The Gemara says that after all, you have 3 mitzvos here, 1 mitzvah there, 3 outrank 1, and therefore you have them in different hands. The question is, you're supposed to have it in a different hand, or you could have them in a different hand. So this is an interesting issue. Some of the Chachmei Provence were of the opinion that you must have them in separate hands. In other words, you can't have too close a connection between the esrog and the other 3 minim. And others felt that there's no such din. They're not the egged, they're not in one egged, but that doesn't mean they can't be in the same hand. If you ever notice, this year again, I don't know what's happening in the Fifth Avenue Synagogue with the Hoshanas, but in many shuls, because of the virus, this year only the chazan is rounding, the bima, for Hoshanas. But back
it was the same in our shul. It was in the same, Rabbi. I surrounded the bima and everybody was on his or her seat. Well, his, of course.
Yeah. Okay, exactly. So, but back in the day, pre-corona, if we can remember that far back, and everybody walked around the bima with their Lulavim and Esrogim, it was very challenging. How do you hold the esrog? So if you remember, there are people, I don't know how the Chazan did it, but, there are people who have these, there's like in the cottage industry, they printed, Hoshana.
Yeah, your shelves like a pamphlet. You hold a little paper.
Yeah, the reason that
they
do that is because some people are makpid, that they want to hold the lulav in their left hand, right? And therefore, in other words, either the balancing is difficult, especially if you have a big esrog, sometimes it's hard to fit it all in one hand, a lulav and esrog. But for halachic reasons, there are some people, because of this issue, think that you dafka are supposed to have the lulav in the left hand. So if you have the lulav of the hadassim and the aravos in your right hand, and you have the esrog in your left hand, how are you going to carry your siddur unless you know the hoshanas by heart?
But
that's not an easy thing, right? So
I hold them all in the right hand and the machzor in the left hand.
Oh, okay. The truth is, I do that too. I don't support the industry of the printing of the separate, but it is a very legitimate shita. I happen to not do it. Certainly not. I think that also is a difference between making the bracha, the tilas lulav and the nanuim, and doing oshanos, frankly. But either way, there are some people who have this kpeda, and it comes from here. But this is it's a technical question, whether the esrog needs the left hand or it can be combined in the right hand outside of the eged. But what I'm trying to say is it's a symbolic question, that goes to the core of the Gemara's discussion, but even more so of the bigger question I'm raising, and that is, how do we relate to these components? I'll just phrase the question, in a starker way before I just mention something else about the esrog. The Rabbi Daniel Habavli was a certain figure, halachic figure. He, had a relationship with the Rambam's son, Rav Avram ben Rambam. And he asked him all sorts of questions about the Rambam's, practices and psakim. So one of the things that he asked was, he wrote a letter to Rav Avram ben Rambam. He said, how come your father only counts the Daled Minim as one mitzvah? He should count them as 4 mitzvahs. Indeed, when the Gemara explains that the 3, meaning the lulav, the hadassim, and ravos are in the right hand, and that the esrog is in the left hand, the way the Gemara explains it is because there are 3 mitzvahs and 1 mitzvah. The 3 should get the right hand. That's the marchashu. The 1, the Gemara calls it 4 different mitzvahs. At the same time, it says meaning you don't fulfill any mitzvah if you only bring the esrog or you only bring the 3 without the 4th. So you have linguistically, right, the Gemara using the expression implying different mitzvahs, and yet, the Sugin Masechet Menachos and Avkot Zayin, which we'll get to in just a second, also based on the Kichatama, that they're ma'akvin, zeh, you need to do all of them. Is it 1 mitzvah or multiple mitzvahs? So that's how Rabbi Daniel Bavli asked Rabbi Avram ben Rambam, maybe your father should count all 4. And, Rabbi Avram ben Rambam said to him, there aren't 4, there's 1. But really, this is kind of what I'm examining a little bit. So with regard to the esrog, also there's a very famous debate among the Chachmei Provence, whether this left hand or in the other hand is ma'akev or not. That's number 1. In addition to that, there's this fascinating discussion in the poskim. If you look on page 4, just for a minute, number 14 is the Taz. So he talks about this question. Tzarich lechaber. Shulchan Aruch says that you should hold the esrog, near the lulav. Right? One question: can you hold it in one hand? That's one question. And for what? must you hold it in the other hand? Even if you hold it in the other hand, should they be separate and apart, right? Like this?
Does it matter if you're a lefty or a righty?
Yeah, that's a debate among the Rishonim as well.
But I thought for Arba Minim you have to put them together. If you separate them, don't they have to be together?
So we're going to discuss that. That's what we're discussing. Well, right now I'm discussing the esrog, which is supposed to be a little bit separate.
No, but I thought the Arba Minim, in other words, to make it work, like when you make the bracha, they have to be together, right? If you make a bracha and one's in the right, one's in the left, are you yotza?
No. The esrog is supposed to be in the left.
No. If they're not together, What
do you mean not together?
Meaning your left hand is on the left side and your right hand's on the right side.
Oh, that's a question, right? So that's a question. So meaning b'diavad certainly you're biyotze. The question is whether you'd biyotze if they're in one hand, right? And how far apart they are. So but lechatchila, what should you do? So this is there's a three law. The Gemara thought that they maybe should be all in one eged, right? The opposite of that is that they must be in two different hands, and maybe even the more apart the better. And in between that is, if you want, you can have them in one hand, even if they're not in one eged.
Well, what's as far to say apart?
Or they should be two hands,
they should be together.
But they should be close together. What?
No. In other words, I thought
you both agree. It's okay.
No. You have a certain view. What I'm trying to tell you is that your view is not wrong, but it's a debate and a discussion.
But Rabbi, may I just insert?
So let me give you the.
May I just insert so quickly? I think that in a way we have to differentiate between when we do the Nanuim.
Yeah, I mentioned that before. Correct.
Yeah, and Nanuim, and when we say Hallel. So for example, when I say the Hallel, I hold them all of course the esrogin on the left side, obviously, but in one hand. But when it comes to the Nanuim, I combine both hands together, and I do the Nanuim.
Right. So there's a question. What I'm trying to point out is that there are different views about one hand. Everybody agrees not in the eged. What about one hand, or dafka two hands together, or two hands separately? And now the Chazan is adding something which I also alluded to before a little bit as well, and that is when I was talking about going around. What's the is it possible to distinguish between when you make the bracha, let's say, the rest of the Nanuim and the Hoshana,
yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Or I'll give you a fifth one. The Gemara says that Anshe Yerushalayim used to walk around with their lovim and esrogim all day because of the chabivus mitzvah. So did they walk around holding them in one hand and two hands apart, right? So there could be 5 different, let's say, venues. Anyways, I just wanted to bring this famous discussion. So the Taz in Orach Chaim, the Shulchan Aruch says tzorich lechaber. That's where Jacob gets it from. So you should hold them together, right? So the where does that come from? So the Beis Yosef b'Shem Rakanadi, the Rishon Rakanadi, Beis Yosef said, Sod zeh nigla elai b'chalom. Fascinating story. He had a dream. In the Sefer Rakanadi, this Sefer called Sefer Rakanadi, he tells a story of this, and the Beis Yosef quotes it, that he had a dream, and in the dream, it was Bilel Yontav Echad Shal Chag HaSukkos, this Achsein Etzli Chassid Echad Ashkenazi. He said this very, he doesn't mean, Hasidim like we, that's a newer phenomenon in history. Reading the Taz is earlier. So Chassid Echad Ashkenazi means a pious, Chassidi Ashkenaz type. Shmo Rabbi Yitzchak. Ra'isi B'chalom, he said he had a dream that this fellow, Sheyakosev Hashem B'Yud Kei, he wrote Yud Kei Vav Kei, Shem Hashem, Vayamarchi Kahei Achrona, Min Hagimel Osios, and his hey wasn't. It had Yud K, Yud Hey Vav, and then like the other hey was far away from the other letters. Amalei, he was disturbed by that. That was a dream. So he woke up from this dream disturbed that he saw the Shem Hashem, in such a distorted way. Amalei Mazeh Asisa. So he turned to this guy and said, what did you do? The guy says, Heshiv, kach noam gim b'mekomenu. Right? That's how we are practice. V'ani machisibo, the kasavtiv shalem. He says, I told him I think it's wrong. And you have to write Shem Hashem, with the letters next to each other. V'eshtomei malamara. He said, and I was stunned by this experience, this dream that I had. The Ein Maven, and I didn't understand where it came from and what triggered this dream. Lamachar, Ra'isi Shalaya Minaneya, Rakalulav, Uminav below Esrog. He saw this chassid, this Chasidei Ashkenaz type, when he did the Nanuim, he didn't do what the Chazan did. He did the Nanuim only with the Lulav and the Hadassim and the Ravos and the Hadassim. He didn't know how, he wasn't holding the Esrog. Ve'vanti pitaron chalomi, ki kol adalad minim romzim bo yizbarach, kid isa b'medrash, v'kosav beis Yosef b'shem Orchayim, dim notlon shneim b'yado achas, kosav a Rabbi Shlomo de lo yotza. That if you have them both in one hand, that you're not yotze. It has to be in a different hand. Kinaminim b'gemara, de lo ogde esrog imayim, d'ksiv kapot v'lo kapot. Ve'im dvarim elu brurim. Now the Taz says, this Beis Yosef in this dream, in this paper, to have, in separate hands, but again, not too far. He says, I don't think the whole thing makes sense. The Gemara had Havamina would be in the Eged. The Gemara is in the Eged. Not in the Eged doesn't mean it has to be in a separate hand. The kapos tamarim. The Gemara didn't say, you might have thought you have to hold it in one hand, Kamash Malan, you have to hold it in two hands. Elabadai, Dafgala igud kapid rachmana, shalo yimayim. Aval biyad echad, lama liba. Assume it is kir betosus vashri become drachim, hechlasos bebracha. Right? How do you make the bracha and what you pick up at this same time, etc. Why did they just say, this idea that you're holding everything in one hand, you're not going to be yotze, you make the bracha over lasiyas, and then you put the esrog in the other hand. No one ever said that. B'kitzur, it turns out there's a major debate. How independent is the esrog supposed to be from the other minim? But the truth is that this is part of a much bigger debate. And that is, how integrated do even the three minim need to be to each other? So the Gemara says, in Sukkot, and Daf Lamed Daled, that there's a major debate between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, whether lulav tzarech eged or not. You look here, one second. Look on page 2, and at number 6. The Gemara records this debate. Ubelplipta dahani tanai. The machlokas hatanaim. The Tanya, lulav bein agud bein ein agud kosher. Even if you don't bind the minim together in the lulav adasim, and the aravas, you take them separately, it's kosher. We'll see what separately means in a minute. Rabbi Yehuda Omar, agud kosher, she'ina agud pasel. My tam Rabbi Yehuda, Yalef lekicha me'eguda says. Rabbi Yehuda learns it out from somewhere. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the need to bind the three minim together is ma'akev the mitzvah. If you take a lulav, hadassim, and a ravos in one hand, and they're not bound together, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you don't fulfill the mitzvah. What do the Rabbanim think? Look at the last line of this little section. The Gemara says, Man tana lahadatan Rabbanan, lulav mitzvah la'ogdo, v'im la'ogdo kosher. There's another mandamar says there's a mitzvah to be ma'aged, to bind the minim together, but if you don't do it, it's kosher. Who is that mandamar? Rabbi Yehuda, kilo agdo my kosher. If you don't do it, then it's pasul. Rabbanan, My mitzvah ka'avid. What's the benefit? The olam rabbanan, u'mitzvah mishum zakei livanayim. So the conclusion is that it's the rabbanan. They think even though you don't have to, it's a mitzvah to do it. And we all paskin like the chachamim. We paskin that you bind the mitzvah. If you look at the Rambam, for example, look on page 1. Page 1, halacha vav, in the middle of 5, the Rambam says, mitzvah min hamuvchar lego dula v'hadas v'arava v'lasos shlashtan aguda achas. Ukeshunot lamlatzes v'hem mevarich tchila al netilas lulav. So we paskin this way, that the chatchila you should be ma'aged altogether. So if we're trying to figure out whether or not, using Rabbi Daniel Abavli and Rabbi Avram ben Rambam, just our logic, to what extent are we dealing with independent mitzvahs or components within a mitzvah, right? The esrog, we already know, is a big, big issue and a big debate. But even the other 3 minim, according to Rabbi Yehuda, they have to be bound together. According to the Chachamim, there's a mitzvah to bind them together. But the Rambam doesn't just say there's a mitzvah to bind them together. The Gemara calls it a mitzvah, and the Rambam calls it mitzvah min hamuvchar, which is a stronger expression. I don't think that's a coincidence. Moreover, the Rambam makes it seem that when you bind them together, that affects the performance of the mitzvah. If you look in Halacha Ches, which is on page 2, the Rambam says something that doesn't appear in the Gemara. He says, go 3 lines down in Halacha Ches. That's the second entry on page 2. Go down 3 lines to the end of the line. V'im ogad halulav, tzorich shehei shedro shalulav, yotze min hadas v'arava, tefach o yeser. The Rambam says something that doesn't appear in the Gemara. No one knows where he got it from. Sounds like logic. What does he say? Earlier, the Rambam explains, based on the Gemara, the lulav has to be at least 4 tfachim high. The hadassim and aravos can be 3 tfachim. They don't need to be 4. However, the Rambam says, when you take the minim together in one eged, when you bind them, which is a mitzvah and a muvchar, in that circumstance, the lulav has to be a tefach taller than the hadassim and aravos. Now, let's say you have big hadassim and aravos. They're 4 tvachim. So then the lulav has to be at least 5. So in one of the Perushim on the Rambam, Rabbeinu Manoach, he notes this Rambam. He says, so I don't know where the Rambam got this from. He probably didn't mean it. He meant probably that there are 2 dinim. One is a minimum shiur, and the other is a relative shiur. That is that the lulav always has to be at least a tefach bigger than the other 2. But that's not what the Rambam says. What he really says is that if you do eged, that changes the equation. Wow. What that means is that according to the Rambam, not only is there a mitzvah of zakei livanveyu to bind the minim together, but when you do that, the mitzvah changes. It becomes not so much, a mitzvah with independent components. It becomes an integrative action. It becomes, an experience in which you are binding together the minim. And therefore there's a relative size issue. Same Rambam, I'm not going to go into this now because that's for another time, has an enormous chiddush. If you look at Halacha Zayin, Rambam says something that caused everyone to work overtime, to try to understand where he got this and how he could believe this. But the Rambam says, Kamanota me'en, lulav echad, esrog echad, shtei badei arava, shlosha badei hadas. Rambam says, how many do you take? You take 1 lulav, 1 esrog, 2 aravos, 3 hadasim. Rambam paskins like Rabbi Shmuel in the Mishnah that we read before, not like Rabbi Akiva. And then he says, Imratza lahosif bahadas, kadeshi aguda gedola, mosif, b'noye mitzvah. If you want to add hadassim to beautify the mitzvah, you could. Aval shara minim, but if you want to add an extra lulav or esrog or more aravos, ein mosifin, vein gorin, you can't add and you can't detract. The mosif agara, the proper girsa should probably be pasul. You disqualify the whole mitzvah. Why do I say that's the girsa? There are two girsos. Because the Ram says that if you subtract, if you don't take all of the minim or all the number of the, if you don't take 3 adasim, 2 aravos, we paskin like Rabbi Yishmael. So that means that the Rambam also thinks that if you take 3 aravos or you take 2 lulavim, that passes the mix. So the Ravid says about that. One second. If you look on page 2, at the very top, Omer Avram, Lo shamati me'olam paslos bazeh, v'lo iser tosefes v'girua. Afilu Rabbi Yehuda, damar lulav tzarech eged. And certainly not for the Chachamim, the kol shekein l'Rabbanim, leading the last line, damar ein tzarech eged, damrinan, v'hai l'chudei kai, v'hai l'chudei kai. The Gemara says in Masechet Sanhedrin, not for now, that if you hold like Rabbi Yehuda and you add to the configuration of the minim, then you ruin it because it's all inside the eged. It's all one object. But if you hold like the Chacham, you don't need eged. Then Haile Chudei Kai, Haile Chudei Kai. Then everything is separate. So you're not really adding. You're just you're like repeating. Interesting. If you look at Tosot on 1 second. If you look at Tosas, I think it's on page 1. Yes, number 3. Tosas explicitly disagrees with the Rambam. Afilu no saying kama hadasim kama ravos belulav ein zebal tosif. Afilu manda martzar heged elam kein mosif min acher. The Rambam has a tremendous chiddush. Normally, bal tosif is if you add a different kind. Not if you add a number to the mix itself. Tosaf says that's not Bal Tosef. The Ravid says that's not Bal Tosef. Either way, the Ravid says only Rabbi Yehuda can speak about a Bal Tosef and lulav that is ma'akev because he holds that you need an eged. But the Rambam paskins like the Chachamim that it's only mitzvah and a mufchar. But it's possible.
But you can do an eged. But you can do an eged with more hadassim and more arobos, and it will still be an eged. So what is the issue?
No, but you're adding, you're being mosif to the proper amount. Just like you can't, the Rambam's saying, you can't take less than 3 hadassim. Forget hadassim, because that's an exception. You can't take less than 2 aravos, right? But you're also allowed to take more.
You're allowed to mishum hidur mitzvah, but
not allowed. You're allowed to take mishum hidur mitzvah hadassim, because that objectively beautifies, but you're not allowed to take more aravos. And you're not allowed to take more lulavim. You're not allowed to take more esrogin, says the Rambam. And the Nosei Kalim said, the Ravid and others say, where did he get that from?
So,
but
just to be clear,
the Rambam was talking about a case of eged. I'll get back to it. So what I'm trying to show is that even though we don't paskin, even though the Rambam doesn't paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, the Rambam goes out of his way to integrate this mitzvah and to tell you that when you use an eged, it isn't just more beautiful, more aesthetically pleasing, it transforms the mitzvah itself. By combining the minim, they're no longer like independent parts of the mitzvah, they're all part of one chalos, one integrated whole. And that expresses itself in relative size, as well as in the numbers. Let me go a step further. Right, Jacob, you mentioned before, Chazan mentioned before, we typically take we don't paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. So if you didn't have an eged, you would fulfill the mitzvah. Are you allowed that? Does that mean you're allowed to pick up the minim separately? Like you could make a bracha, pick up the lulav, put it down, pick up the esrog, put it down, pick up the hadassim, put it down, pick up the aravos, put them down. So this is a debate between Bahag, Bal Halachas Gedolos. Look at look at number 4 on page 1. So this is Tosas. Tosas says, Bakometz Rabbah, in the Gemara Menachos, Masik, the Gemara concludes, Hodem Akvi Adadi, Lo Shanu Ela She'ein Lo. Aval Yesh Lo, Ein Ma'akvin. The Gemara says all the minim have to be brought. You can't just bring 3 or 2. Even if you don't have any more, you don't fulfill the mitzvah. However, says the Gemara, that's only true if you don't have all of them. If you have all of them, then Ein Ma'akvin. What does that mean? So the Tosas quotes, Upirish B'halachas Gedolos, one of the earliest rabbinic sources after the Talmud is the author of the Halachas Gedolos. We're not really sure who he is, but he's a famous Gaonic authority. He said, Ein ma'akvin delo tema adam agbil b'hadi adadi, eli magbi kolchad v'chad l'chudei shaperdami. The kaima lulvein tzarech eket. The Bahag said what the Gemara meant was, you don't have to pick up the minim all at once. You certainly don't need an eged. That's Rabbi Yehuda. We don't paskin like him. You don't even need to pick them all up at one time. You can pick them up separately as long as you have all of them. But Rabbi Tam disagrees. Rabbi Tam higia b'sifro lo shanu dema'akvin mishum tama ela she'eno. He added a few words. Aval yesh lo tamahu alfa pisha lo chibro be'egdo. Now, according to Rabbi Tam, all the Gemara meant was you don't have to bind them with a ring, but you do have to pick them up at one time. So what comes out of all this? We don't pass it like Rabbi Yehuda, fine. So you could think, well, within the worldview of the Chachamim, how separate are these minim, and how much are they like pieces of a single entity? The answer is Rabbi Tam is pushing the agenda that they're really, at least they have to be picked up simultaneously. Whereas the Bahag is not. The Rambam holds like the Bahag and not Rabbeinu Tam, but if you look very carefully at the way that he formulates it, once again, the Rambam consistently pushes the integration theory. Look, for example, at the Rambam, halacha, just one second. One second, I'm missing it here. It's halacha, Vav. So I'm going to try to show you, because I want to finish up in the next couple of minutes. This halacha Vav of the Rambam is the key, to his position. Almost every word in the Rambam, halacha Hey and Vav. Almost every word in the Rambam is innovative when you compare it to the earlier sources upon which it's based. And again, the Rambam is of such stature, that his language, became part of the common parlance of halachic authorities. And that sometimes desensitizes us to how significant and innovative his employment of terminology really is. So the Rambam actually begins his discussion of lulav in a very unusual fashion. Instead of formulating that there's a mitzvah of lulav, the Rambam begins by describing each of the 4 minim separately. He starts off with kapos tamarim, ha'amur b'torah, what is it? Pri eitz hadar, ha'amur b'torah, what is it? Anaf eitz avos, armei nachal. The Rambam begins a sukkah this way also, and it's also unusual. Typically, the Rambam begins the halachos that deal with a certain mitzvah by formulating the mitzvah, by quoting the pasuk, by telling you what the mitzvah is. When it comes to sukkah for its reason, not for now, and lulav for its reason, unusually the Rambam begins not by formulating the mitzvah, but by identifying the components. That's subtle, but that's surprising. Then the Rambam goes further. He actually begins with this Gemara in Menachos and says, when he finally speaks about the mitzvah, Arba minimelu mitzvah achasein. Even though the Gemara said there are 3 mitzvahs in the right hand and 1 mitzvah in the left hand, the Rambam didn't need to address this question here, but obviously felt that he did. The first thing he says is the 4 are 1. Uma'akvin zeh. And then he adds again something which is not in the Gemara exactly, and therefore it is part of his conviction. V'kulan nikraim mitzvah lulav. The Gemara says that the reason that we make a bracha al natilas lulav is because the lulav is the highest, and therefore it's the min that stands out. The Rambam quotes that halacha a little bit later. Even before he mentions that, he uses the phrase v'kulam nikraim mitzvah lulav, because he's trying to integrate all 4 into 1. That's consistent with saying arba minim mitzvah achasein. And then he says ein poksin mehen ein mosifin aleim. You can't do more, you can't do less. Im lo nimtzah mehem ein meviin tachtav min acher adom b'lo. Then comes the next halacha, where he quotes the din of Eged, and he says, mitzvah min amuvchar legod lulav hadas v'rava v'lasos shloshta negudachas. Not just mitzvah, but mitzvah min amuvchar. And I already explained that the Rambam consistently believes that when you use an Eged, it's not just a nicety, it binds the minim together more. In other words, he doesn't paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, but he's influenced by Rabbi Yehuda. That's totally consistent with saying Harela mitzvah achas, with saying the kula nikroim mitzvah lulav. There's a pattern in the Rambams. Ukeshunot lam latzeis bahen, he says mevorech tchila al natilas lulav, and he gives a reason that is different from the reason given in the Gemara. Hoel v'kulan smuchin lo, meaning the Gemara says because one is higher than the other. Rabbeinu Manoach explains. Now, what the Rambam is trying to say here is that the reason that you make the bracha on the lulav is because of the principle of mevarchin ala ikar upoter es hatafel. There's a famous, discussion in the Rishonim. Rabbeinu Simcha says, let's say you do what the Bahag says you could do. You could pick up each of the minim separately. You pick up a lulav, put it down. Then you pick up the esrog, then you pick up whatever order. So let's say you talk after you made the bracha before you pick up all the minim. As you make a bracha, you pick up the lulav, you put it down, then you say something, then you pick up the hadas. So Rabbeinu Simcha says you have to repeat the bracha. But the question is, what bracha do you then make? So some of the Rishonim say you make the bracha on the minim that you haven't yet taken. Like now you make a bracha on the hadas or on the arava. That's what the Taz says. But there are some Rishonim who say that you'll continue to make the bracha all birchas lulav even when you pick up separately the hadas and the arava. I think that's the Rambam's view. I can't prove that because it doesn't discuss this case. That's what he means when he says v'kulan nikroim mitzvahs lulav and v'kulan smuchen lo. Let's say you did the bahag. You picked up all the minim separately. Let's say the first thing you didn't pick up was the lulav. It was the esrog. I think you'd still make the bracha on the lulav. Meaning, the Rambam subtly, but again and again and again, through his language and through his chidushim, is telling you this is one mitzvah. And then he says, Achar kach notel ha'aguda zos bimino v'esrog b'smolo l'noton derech gidei lasan she'ikarein lamata v'rashein lamala. And then he adds, v'im lo ogdan, if you didn't tie them together, v'notlan echad echad, now he's referring to the Bahag. Notice how, even when he quotes the Bahag, who he agrees with, not Rabbeinu Tam, even then, he reformulates it to be closer to Rabbeinu Tam and to Rabbi Yehuda. So what does he say? Im lo ogdan v'notlan echad echad yatsa. V'hu sheyiu arba'asan mitzuyin etzlo. only if all four of the minim are present when he begins to make the bracha on any of them. Meaning, the Hag didn't say that. The Hag just said you need to have all four. They don't have to be present in front of you. It's not even clear that you have to know that you had all four. Just that unless you know you have all four, you could be involved in the bracha levatala. But the Rambam says they all have to be physically present. It's not even enough to know where they are. And the Ramban attacks the Rambam. He says, like, what's the point of that? Once you're holding like the Bahag, that each component can be done separately, why do they need to be present, visually? But the answer is that according to the Rambam, all of this, even when the Pu'ula Samitzvah is independent, all of this constitutes a single whole. Just like the 7 in the Mikdash days and the 1 in the Gvulin is the same mitzvah, so too, to answer, Rav Daniel Abavli's question, Rav Roman Rambam should have been in this case more emphatic. My father, if you look carefully at what he wrote, the substance and the language, not only, is it justified that he only counted one mitzvah, because it's one pasuk and so on, but even more than that, he, more than anyone, promoted the view that this is an integrated whole, a single mitzvah. So what is this really all about? The answer is that Chazal explain that the minim represent symbolically all sorts of different components and values that are important, even indispensable, to the wide-ranging, eclectic, you can call it, Jewish community. And number 13, I brought the words of Rabbeinu Bechai because he just has a very wide range in his analysis. Al derech hamedrash, Pri Tzadar is Avram, right? Kapos Tamar, Yitzchak, Anaf Etzavos, Yaakov, Arba Nachal, Yosef. Then he has, of course, Daled Varim, the four, active, elements of the body and what they represent. The Avos, as we just said, and of course the famous medrash of Tam and Reach representing Torah, and Masim Tovim representing different kinds of Jews. I don't want to go into all the details. He has mystical elements, as the Rakaneti Beis Yosef story that we quoted earlier prove as well. In the end of the day, the idea seems to be that Lulav is indeed a parallel, and therefore, in some respect, is the coda to Yom Kippur. After all, we begin the Yom Noraim period with diversity, but a diversity, that directs us, right, to a single goal, albeit again a single goal that, given, the different backgrounds and challenges that every individual member of Klal Yisrael faces, is going to require flexibility and a wide range. So we start off with Zichron Trua and Malchus and Zichronos and Shofros and Tekiah and Shmiya, and the different definitions of Trua, all of which highlight that range that we need as individuals and as a community for all of Klal Yisrael to be encompassed in the process of tshuva for each of us each year according to our specific history, to be able to undergo that process. And then we move towards Sarasimei Tshuva, we move towards Yom Keit Slicho Mechila L'Yachid L'Rabim, the issue that we spoke about last time, namely Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a day which has many moving pieces, but they're all fully integrated. Everything is done by the Kohen Gadol. Everything is black and white. There's the seer, L'Azazel. The reason it's L'Azazel is because it's not Lifnai v'Lifnim. it doesn't go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim and break one rule, then it has no spiritual standing whatsoever. The process, which begins with complexity and an acknowledgement of diversity, for the individual and for the community, is one which, at a certain point, becomes a test of loyalty and a way of establishing our credentials of Kulal Hashem. And then comes Chag HaSukkos, where the Avoda B'Yira is replaced by Avoda Be'ahava or B'Simcha. Sukkot, of course, is the holiday of Simcha, right? V'samachta b'chagecha v'yisa'ach sameach. And even more so, U'smachta b'fnei Hashem Elokeichem shivas yamim, the pasuk that we have been zeroing in on this evening. And that's why the apex of what the Rambam calls Simcha Yisera is in the Beis HaMikdash, Simchas Beis HaShoeva. It's spoken of in the Rambam in the end, interestingly, of the Chaslulah. The whole concept of Avoda B'Simcha is spoken about and developed in the Rambam in the end of the Chaslulah. You go from Ein Baim Simcha Yisera Yemei Yira V'Fachad to Yemei Simcha. But in the end, you have to integrate in that, which is the avoda of all year round, that same level of complexity. Like Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, there has to be a single goal, a consistency, a purpose, a process, and at the same time, one which acknowledges the eclectic needs of the community, the fact that there are different kinds of Jews, that there are legitimate elu ve'elu, emphases within that, and that even each individual, has different inclinations, propensities, etc. And therefore, with the mitzvah of lulav, which parallels the parsha of lulav, which parallels the ach, the different mikra kodesh, the tamei mitzvos, with that you have this remarkable meld of Gevulin and Mikdash, which you have in Yom Kippur, as well as the meld of a single mitzvah, which itself integrates components, acknowledges the lulav, the esrog, the hadassim, and the aravos, acknowledges that there's even a different configuration, numbers for the, some are 1, some are 2, some are 3. To use language of the Rambam, ein mosifin aleim, ein gorin mehem. But at the end of the day, that mitzvah min hamuvkar la'agdam, that even if you go the route of the Bahag, that they should be mitzuyim etzleinu, that kulam nikraim al shem halula. And that in the end, the ritzui and the halal and the simcha that is brought about by the Dalet Minim is really a parallel to what takes place on Yom Kippur, but in the aftermath of Yom Kippur and on the level of Simcha. Then, of course, you have, Hoshana Rabbah, which, from a mystical point of view, certainly is a revisiting of Yom Kippur themes, but again, within the context of the Simcha of Chag HaSukkos and within the context of the Dalet Minim and the special akafos that take place on that day. So it's very remarkable, that the Torah presents it in this way. A second parsha, the language paralleling Yom Kippur. It's very remarkable that the Torah presents in one pasuk an integration of Mikdash and Gvulin and of 4 that are 1. But at the end of the day, it's the perfect way to articulate the experience of the Yom Naraim, which begin Rosh Hashanah, which seemingly culminate Yom Kippur, Keitzman, Slicha Mechila Liyachid U'Lerabim, but as Ramban points out, HaChodesh Hazeh, HaChodesh Hashvi Hazeh links Sukkot, both in terms of Sukkah and Lulav, once again, to that process. And even the Sukkah, which is in the first parsha in Emor, becomes redefined by its proximity to and connection with the ach, the usmachtem of the mitzvah. So I want to wish everybody moadim l'simcha. Should enjoy the last days of this very remarkable Chag. Stam Chag is Chag HaSukkos, and Shmini Atzeres, which is a Chag b'fnei atzmo, is still also Man Simchasenu. And but to know that it isn't just a time of joy; it's a time of joy, because of the themes that are so meaningful in our lives. And so I want to wish you all an enjoyable rest of the Chag, and we look forward. We'll try to figure out the exact details, continuing our regular shir on Masachet Psachim going forward.
Rabbi, thank you so much. Sure.
Big Yasher Koach, Rabbi. I saw in one of the Sforim I was looking. I saw in one of the Sforim I was looking during the first 2 days of Sukkot. So a Rebbe, Hasidic Rebbe, I don't know, well-known one, I forgot, I think it was a Talmud of the Baal Shem Tov, said that the difference between Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur on one hand and Sukkot on the other hand is the following, that Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is Avodas Hashem Bapeh. And on Sukkot is Avodas Hashem Bayadayim. Because Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, obviously, Bapeh, Besliches, and we fear the Ribono Shel Olam and everything, and Bayadayim means the Lulav and Esrog.
Beautiful. People also say that about the Sukkah, that it's the only mitzvah practically which you can do with, your entire body, because your presence is a Sukkah. And so I think it's a very nice, that's a nice comment. Even the shofar is bipeh, in a way. As we said, Shomea kol shofar, it's inarticulate prayer. So it too is tefillah.
But with the shofar, it is one person who blows the shofar, and everybody else listens and answers.
Or that's the mitzvah of shmiya. So it seems like that. But the shmiya sakol is something that belongs to everybody.
Yeah, of course.
So that
yes.
But again, you're right. Netilas lulav and yeshiva b'sukkah, represent very different. And what's fascinating, of course, is that Shmini Atzeres has no mitzvos. So you go from that enrichment seemingly to an impoverished, but it isn't really the case either, because it's a transition, and therefore tefillah and Talmud Torah, which are really what sustain us all year round, are accentuated, on Shmini Atzeres, precisely because it doesn't need anything else. That's the kasha lai, predaska.
Yeah.
Anyways, a good evening.
In regards to the family.
Pleasure as always. Tell your grandson we noticed him in the background.
Okay, we absolutely will.
Rabbi, you moved away a little bit from your usual spot.
I'm not home. Yeah. I'm out of town, actually. Yeah.
So another observant Jew.
Yeah.
Notice that.
Well, we're family. We're happily sharing the Chag with family members. So
nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
So you're right. It's not the usual background.
Yeah, no, Sforim I can see, but it's okay.
Right. Anyways, Moadim L'Simcha, it was really wonderful.
Moadim L'Simcha, Chagim Uzmanim L'Sason.
As I say, we look forward to the sandwiches and the Dofen Akuma next year, and the rest of it as well.
Thank you so much,
Kol Tov, Rabbi. Thank you very, very much. It was wonderful shiur, a great shiur, and we learned a lot.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the nice words of introduction. Appreciate it.
It's okay. Thank you. That's the least I can do.
Yes,